Everyone, and welcome to Tisch College's Civic Life event with Michelle Bowdler called Is Rape a Crime? A Memoir, Investigation, and Manifesto. My name is Brian Felter, and I'm a senior in the School of Arts and Sciences, double majoring in biology and psychology. I'm also the co-coordinator for Sex Health Reps through the Center for Awareness, Resources, and Education, or CARE at Tufts, which is a co-sponsor of today's conversation about Michelle's book. It's my pleasure to kick off today's event, as well as introduce our author and our questioner. In addition to CARE, we are grateful to the support of our wonderful co-sponsors for supporting today's program, including Jumbo Vote and the School of Arts and Sciences. Tisch College has many events and civic leaders visiting campus virtually this fall. In fact, on Wednesday evening, we will be welcoming activist, organizer, and co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, Latasha Brown. You can find more information about this event and register for that event and others by visiting tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. I want to remind everyone in the Zoom room today that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions during the event. If you have a question or two, please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time, and our moderator, Grace Talusan, will read them for our speaker later in the program. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guests, Michelle Bowdler and Grace Talusan. Michelle Bowdler is the Executive Director of Health and Wellness at Tufts University, and after graduating from the Harvard School of Public Health, has worked on social justice issues related to rape for well over a decade. Is Rape a Crime? A Memoir, Investigation, and Manifesto is her first book and was recently longlisted for the National Book Award, a tremendous honor, and it has received a starred review from Publishers Weekly and Shelf Awareness. Bowdler is a recipient of a 2017 Barbara Deming Memorial Award and has been a fellow at Ragdale and McDowell. Michelle's writing has been published in the New York Times, 2 anthologies, and a number of literary journals, and her essays have been nominated twice for Pushcart Prizes. Joining Michelle's conversation today is a Tufts alumnus, Grace Talusan, who is the recipient of the U.S. Fulbright Fellowship to the Philippines and an Artist Fellowship Award from the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Talusan is currently the Fannie Hurst Writer-in-Residence at Brandeis University. At Tufts, she has taught writing for many years to the English department, and she currently teaches 2 courses for Tisch College students, the Tisch Scholars Foundation course, Civic Identity, Reflection, and Action, and the Tufts 1+4 program course, Communicating for Change. Talusan is also an award-winning author who has recently won the Massachusetts Book Award for Nonfiction for her first book, The Body Papers, a memoir that chronicles her life as a Filipina immigrant and survivor of trauma and illness. Her short story, The Book of Life and Death, was also recently chosen as the Boston Book Festival's One City, One Story, and was distributed widely throughout the city. We are honored to host these 2 amazing individuals today, and so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Bowdler and Grace Talusan.
Thank you, Brian, for that kind introduction, and to the sponsors of today's events, especially my colleagues at Tisch College, and most of all to Michelle Bowdler, as it is always a treat and an honor to speak with you. I'm thrilled that so many of you have gathered today to spend your lunch hour with us so that we can focus our attention on such an important book, Is Rape a Crime? As someone who has also experienced and written about sexual assault, I am in awe of what Michelle Bowdler has achieved. This book is essential reading and should be taught in universities, law schools, police academies, anywhere people are working towards a better society. For those who have not read Is Rape a Crime? It follows Michelle over decades as she searches for answers about the night at the beginning of her post-college life that she was violently and repeatedly raped by 2 intruders. She returns to this central question, is rape a crime, throughout the braided narrative of Memoir, Investigation, and Manifesto, even when the answer is devastating. It's not that we don't believe the victims, we don't particularly care. But this is not a book about despair. Baudler arms the reader with knowledge and analysis, along with the power of a story to change hearts and minds. Even though there is a tremendous amount of work and change still to accomplish, I think it is also important to recognize positive shifts, even in my lifetime. Because I felt pressure to suffer invisibly and silently, I could not have imagined being in front of you today, my community, speaking so openly and directly about rape and sexual assault. The fact that we can have a conversation without me hiding my identity out of fear of repercussions is evidence that something has shifted, even if that change is not nearly enough. Because Michelle's book has been so visible, highlighted in many of best of lists, including the long list for the National Book Award and Publishers Weekly Best Books of 2020, my hope is that every time someone comes across the title, "Is Rape a Crime?" that they pause and seriously consider that question. So Michelle will read for a few minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, and around 20 of, I'll start taking questions from the audience and delivering them to Michelle. So Michelle.
Okay, well, thank you, Grace, and thank you, Brian. And I just want to say that this is one of the greatest honors that I could possibly have, speaking at a school where I have worked for over 20 years and have had the pleasure and honor of talking to so many students over time about how we're responding to this issue. And so thank you. And also to be with Grace Talusan, who is a friend and somebody whose work I admire so much, and to have her be so generous about my writing is also a huge thrill. So I am going to read a little bit to get us started, and I'm going to read a piece that, just to orient you, it's at a time in 2007 when we were, there was an article in the Boston Globe that changed the trajectory of how I thought about my own attack and helped me get involved in national activism and advocacy in this work. At the same time that I was working at Tufts, and a lot of people still didn't even know my history. And so that comes later, but I did want to just orient you before I read. A single article in the Boston Globe led me back to my rape case and changed the trajectory of my life. It was 2007. I had finished my graduate degree and started a job at a liberal arts university, that would be Tufts, just outside Boston. A significant part of my role involved ensuring the medical and mental health staff responded skillfully to students who disclosed sexual assault and provided university resources to support them. The job engaged me in meaningful work, and my home life sustained and nurtured me. From the outside, I'm sure it looked as if I had done the hard-fought work of moving on, but I suffered still. Something was gnawing at me. There remained an unfinished and unattended to piece of my past, but I didn't know exactly what. A little over 20 years had passed since the rapes, and yet I still felt that what had happened to me lay just below the surface of my consciousness. Whatever closure I had delicately hovering in the balance, waiting to be undone. I saw disregard everywhere I looked at, and I took it personally. Comments by politicians, news stories about rape cases that went nowhere, campus responses to sexual assault at colleges around the country, as well as where I worked. I tried hard to understand what I needed to do to heal the still deep wounds, but I couldn't quite do so. The Boston Globe headline that stunned me one day as I drank my morning coffee read, "Crime Lab neglected 16,000 cases. Evidence was never analyzed. Probe finds." Evidence samples from thousands of crime scenes across Massachusetts, including nearly 1,000 homicides and 6,500 sexual assaults, were never analyzed by the State Police Crime Lab, according to an investigation of the lab ordered by the state. The article began. These untested samples dated back to the 1980s and were of, quote, crisis proportions. The piece followed reporting several months prior regarding the urgent need for an audit of the state crime lab. Quote, "An administrator at the troubled State Police Crime Laboratory has been suspended for failing to tell prosecutors of DNA matches in a number of unsolved rape cases, which now cannot be pursued because the statute of limitations has expired. The audit was done, which then led to massive numbers of additional untested samples being reported. As I pored over the article, my mind returned to the rape kit that I had endured, believing it would be used as part of an investigation. I thought of the other break-ins that summer. Could any of the victims' evidence be linked to mine? Had they been able to connect any of our cases to the same perpetrators? Or could the evidence kits all have just been sitting together for 2 decades in the state crime lab, untested even as DNA technology improved? Then State Attorney General Martha Coakley disputed the findings, stating that there were more like 2,000 untested samples. Despite Coakley's assertions, the Secretary of Public Safety, Kevin Burke, stayed firm about the report's conclusion, and according to Boston Globe reporting, insisted that the study found 16,000 untested biological samples that must be processed. Top state officials continued to reassure the public that they had the situation under control, and to suggest that the issue was too complicated for the public to understand. Prosecutors argued in the same Globe article that thousands of the untested samples are from suicides, drug overdoses, and criminal cases where other evidence or guilty pleas made the biological evidence unnecessary at trial. The latter part of this statement ignores the reality that many rapists are serial perpetrators. Deciding that available forensic material will not be tested has the potential to impact countless lives.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
I think, you've written about such an important issue, and even that moment of coming across the article, it brings back again these problems that we have, because there's this, a crime happens, and then there's this part that the victim tries to gather their courage and strength to do, which is to submit their body as a sample and specimen, really, and to go through that process of going through the getting the samples taken, because they're thinking like, okay, this is what I need to do. It's the last thing I would ever want to do, like right after an assault, and yet I'm going to do it because that's the way to do my part towards trying to find justice. And then for you to come across this study and to find, what the reality is on the other end of that system, and that those aren't being received in the ways that we expected, is really devastating. And this is the first question I have is sort of connected to this, to your reading, which I've been lucky enough to go to some of your events, and even for today's event, I find the same question coming up again and again, which I think is part of what you just read, and it's the title, and it's the decision, the provocation, your why you've decided to title the book in the way that you have, and I wondered if you could talk with us a little bit about your process of deciding that, especially because this conversation is happening in the context of civic life studies, and thinking about, what even does like titling your book have to do with civic engagement and engaging in that kind of life.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And it is a bold title, and it was something that I decided with the editor of the book and my agent. And the book initially had a very esoteric title of a line of poetry that I loved, and nobody really even understood what the book was going to be about. And the title originally comes from a line in the book where I was doing national advocacy work, and I was sitting with a survivor or victim who had been the victim of a serial perpetration that would have been prevented had they tested rape kits routinely in Memphis, Tennessee, and they did not. And we were supposed to be talking to law enforcement about how on earth they were going to ever be able to knock on people's doors or call them on the phone and say, hey, guess what? Those rape kits that we never paid any attention to for decades? We now know who your perpetrator is, but there's no prosecution possible, and we probably could have prevented what happened to you. And we were trying to engage them in how they might talk about this in a way that would not be harmful. And I remember saying, well, you need to start by apologizing, and you need to start by talking about what it is you're going to do moving forward. And there was a lot of, but what are we supposed to say to these people? And so she looked at me and she said, after this event was over, you really have to ask yourself, is rape a crime? When our cases, it's not that people tried to investigate and failed, there were no investigations. And, you know, and so I started, it really sat with me. And in the book, you'll see that I think the data is that, first of all, it's the most underreported crime for a lot of reasons, and a lot of good reasons, and a lot of sad reasons about people who really can't report because it's not safe for them to report. But so if a quarter of rapes are reported, it means that these are the ones that people, for all the reasons that they are going because they're hoping that an investigation can move forward. And there are 5 out of every 1,000 rapes that result in any jail time whatsoever. And although I am not a pro-carceral person, that is the lowest conviction rate for any major felony. And as I say in my book, is there anything else in our society that's both an international weapon of war and also used as a sure laugh at a comedy club? Like, it's just not, something's very, very wrong in the way that we look at crimes of rape, and we really need to address it. So I think that question is a legitimate question, unfortunately, and it needed to be asked, even though it initially makes people say, what are you talking about? How dare you ask that question? Well, if you read the book, I think you might come to the same conclusion.
Yes, and even having the word rape in the title, I think, is also very bold. There are ways that we don't even want to say the word, or we I mean, I'm talking even about myself, about ways to talk around it and to even use other language, because it is such a powerful, it does describe such a powerful crime or act. And for a while, like for years, I mean, people had to fight to actually put laws on the book to make it a crime and to not have so many qualifiers, right? Like date rape, spousal rape. I mean, it's rape. So, yeah. It brings me to this next question, which is from an audience member, V. Continuing to look at the power of language and its relationship to policy, an audience member wanted to know how the legal language reflects the patriarchal system of power and gender balance.
So I think that there's a few things to say about that. I think it's more, I would argue that it's more how the crime is treated by society that really reflects the patriarchy. And so, for example, they say that, you know, the estimates from psychologists and people who do work on trauma, that maybe 2 to 8% of rape cases are considered false or baseless. But I even think it's lower than that. And I have to wonder who makes those decisions to sort of even say that, because like I say in the book, getting a rape kit done and reporting a rape is not something people would ever do if they had another choice. One of the things about rape cases that I think is particularly interesting is that when they move forward, which is rare, the prosecution of a perpetrator is the state, not the victim. So the state is deciding whether this case should move forward, and it's not whether the victim feels strongly that it should move forward, but it really gets out of their hands. And I think that the feeling of a loss of control is something that marginalized people, you know, which is the vast majority of rape victims. That it's women, children, people of color, LGBTQ people are victimized at much higher rates, and yet also are people who experience and have the least power in our society. And the other thing is that law enforcement is still overwhelmingly represented, does not represent the people who are often victims of this crime. And I think that is also important for us to look at in terms of people's comfort coming forward, and also whether gender can impact how people's perception of whether a case can go forward or not. There are categories in terms of language, there are categories that are available to law enforcement called unfounded or exceptionally cleared. And there are very strict legal definitions about when those should be used. Exceptionally cleared, for example, because the perpetrator has died, or because the victim no longer wants to pursue charges. But we're finding more and more that some cities use those cases as high as 30 to 50% to say a case is unfounded, as opposed to doing the investigation. How do you know it's unfounded or it can be cleared without an investigation even taking place? So I think that our use of language in a way to dismiss an investigation before it even occurs is part of what's so problematic. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, and this is it does, and this is in line with what you're talking about, and it takes it a little further. So we're talking about language and power, and then you were talking a little bit about the ways that we punish or incarcerate folks and the carceral system. And so I wanted to share that for me, when and I'm aware also, Michelle, that you brought up earlier that there's these moments where we are talking about these things theoretically, like policies about sexual assault and everything. But I think we also have to remind ourselves, like, this is also something that we experienced, and that adds another dimension to how we talk about things, how we experiencing them, and so forth. So yeah, so I wanted to share that for me, that the first week that after I was sexually assaulted by my grandfather, and it is something that happened every night for me for the 7 years that he lived with my family, one of my teachers noticed something was wrong with me, like, pretty quickly. This is before there was, I don't blame her, this is before there was that policy on the books about teachers being mandatory reporters. But she did notice something profoundly had changed about me. But even at 7 years old, even though no one had ever told me about what would happen to somebody if they were convicted of a sex offense, even as a child, I had this image of this is what would happen. Like, my grandfather would be put in jail, and he would be incarcerated. And even though that is supposed to be our deterrent for offenders, like, oh, people won't want to offend because they don't want to go to jail, it was actually a deterrent to me. Yes. To not want to say anything. So I was, I didn't want to involve the police or other authorities. I was afraid that this was going to be taken out of my control. I mean, I was in no position to make those sorts of decisions. I was 7 years old, but I just wonder if there had been alternatives that I've known about to the prison system, if there was just other ways that this could have been resolved. I wonder if I would have been able to say something earlier. And a few of the people in the audience had submitted questions earlier, and they were particularly interested about restorative justice. And their questions, I'll ask both of their questions. One, does the US legal system lean towards restorative justice for victims or rehabilitation for offenders? And what does restorative justice look like when it comes to rape?
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent question, and I think it's very complicated in our present system. Our prison system is broken, and it is racist, and it is so problematic that it was really important to me as I wrote this book to think about how to write about rape as a crime, but also to address the fact that we have a broken system that we don't necessarily, that we also need to be looking at. And I know a lot of people are. I also want to add, Grace, that before I answer that question, that part of the reason, like your experience, unfortunately, makes up a huge percentage of the cases of rape cases in our country, that over 30% of people are perpetrated against before they are at the age of 16. And so people often can't come forward because somebody is a family member, they're the breadwinner, they're afraid of putting them in a system that is known to perpetrate against people of color, and so it's complicated, or they're beloved in their community, they're a coach, they're part of someone's spiritual life, and it's very, very complicated. So I just wanted to say, for people who haven't reported, that there are very good reasons for not reporting, and so I just wanted to make that point. Now, when it comes to justice, I think it's really complicated, because restorative justice, I know that for some people, it would, and for people who don't know a lot about it, it really has to do with a series of things that people have to go through and have to agree to, and have to have sort of maybe a similar idea of what the outcome is going to be. Sometimes the outcome, what the victim is looking for is, I want the person to understand the harm that they've done, and I want them to get help, and I want them to get some training about what it is that they did, the harm that it was, and I also want them to say they're sorry. I want them to understand it, and I want them to mean it. But I also don't want to feel like, in going through that process, I'm doing it for them, and that it will make them feel less guilty or them feel better about what happened. I'm doing it for me. And I think it's really important for the person who's thinking, the victim or survivor who's thinking about going through that process, to understand it fully and to be able to move out of it anytime they want. And that they really trust that the person who is the person helping them move through the process is highly trained and highly skilled. I also think that it is not a full solution to crimes of rape, because crimes of rape are violent crimes where one study showed that over 60% of people who experience rape and sexual assault, even when they know the perpetrator and know them well, believe that the attack will end in their death. So this is not something that you can simply say, well, let's have that for everybody, that restorative justice is appropriate. And that if there's serial perpetration, and when there is, it's by nature use of force. And I guess I know that people who are watching this know that we're going to talk about tough material, but I just want to say that if anybody needs to take a little break or mute us, please do. But when there's weapons involved, when there's threats of death, and when we know that serial perpetration is real, we can't say that for all rape cases, unlike murder, unlike home invasion, unlike robberies, that rape is this super special thing that we can't prosecute anyway, and we don't really, it's so hard to figure out, and isn't it really he said, she said, spoiler alert, no, it's not. And the fact that we even use that term, that offensive term, which acts like, it's as likely that someone saying they've been raped it's as likely as not that they're lying. is extremely problematic, and we need to figure out how to believe people and investigate crimes and test rape evidence before we decide that we can move forward to a very, very different system. So,
yeah, thank you. So these are questions more about your experience with publishing the book and, being out in the world with it. So I encourage my students to write and practice and tell stories about their lives, because I believe that stories can be transformative, both for the person who's telling the story and potentially for listeners. And now that your story in this book has been in the world for the past several months, and I know that it's under different circumstances than you imagined because of the pandemic, I'm curious, like, what has it meant to you, and what is this journey experience? What's it been like? Have you noticed some change around conversations or other things, with the book in the world?
yeah, I think that's a great question. And I will say that it has gone better than I ever could have expected. I think part of that was because the people I surrounded myself with who helped get the book ready to be published, my editor in particular, I felt so safe and trusting of, that I believed that the decisions that we were making were in my best interest. And that's also been true for the publicist. And that has been super, super helpful to me and my agent. If I didn't feel that way, I could have felt more exploited, or that the title was chosen to, be bold and get headlines as opposed to really trying to make an important point. Having said that, I will say that what has happened so far is that it hasn't been what I thought it might be. That I haven't felt any sense of trauma. I've felt a huge sense of relief and pride and excitement that the book is being received well. And the other thing that's happened is I've started to hear from people. And it might be a private message on Twitter or Instagram of people saying, this book made me feel seen, or I always wondered why I never heard anything about my rape kit, and now I'm going to look more into what happened in my city. Or, my mother's 75, and I knew that and again, I'm being vague, but, my mother's 75 years old, and I knew she had been raped, and I always wondered what it was that I didn't really feel like I understood about times when she seemed different than what I would have expected, and now I feel like I do. And it's very, very heartening to me. And also I've started to hear from writers who say they like the book, and it means a lot. It means a lot, and it's been, overwhelmingly a fantastic experience.
I'm so glad to hear that, because I think I've experienced this myself just a year and a half ago. I had so much fear in publishing this material about myself as the both writer and narrator. Like, I worked in fiction for a lot of my life, and some of that is because I was able to attribute like characteristics to characters and say, oh, that's the character.
Right.
But as what you did, like having a book of nonfiction, a memoir, and having those two match, being the author and the subject, the person that the thing happened to, I had a lot of fear. But now that, I think, and I've had a similar experience, like I get these notes that I did not expect to get. I expected it to be a traumatic experience where I felt vulnerable and exposed. But actually publishing the book has been the opposite of that.
Yes.
And I think that's an important message, because whether people publish books or not, just this notion that a story is so dangerous that you have to hold it to yourself and not tell anybody, that's not necessarily true. It might be true in cases where people aren't physically safe and all of that, but I think, it's important to challenge what I thought, which is that I should never let anybody know what happened to me, because it's going to be used against me.
Yes.
It's not my experience.
No.
I have not been hurt by publishing the book. And I think that, and it's heartening for me to hear that that it's a similar experience for you, and that you are getting those notes back in these ways that you know that your message is received. Someone got it and heard it, and maybe they'd never heard that before and they needed to, and it'll start to spark change and other things for lots of people.
Yeah, and I hope so. And I also just as a caveat would say that I don't think I could have written the book any sooner than I did. And so, you know, sometimes people will ask, and I'm sure your students ask you, when do I know if I'm ready to write something? And I think that is important too, that what you might write about the first time you write something may hold back a little bit, and you might even know you're holding back a little bit, and that's okay. And we reveal things to others and to ourselves in degree. And when those can mesh, I think is when you might feel more ready to write something, or to, you know, get up at a protest. I used to marvel at the Tufts students who could get up at protests and talk about things that I was like, okay, so they are making a choice to talk about things, and I think they felt like they had no choice. Like, I have to talk about this because I need change to happen, and that taught me a lot. It taught me a lot. I really learned from that.
Yeah, I agree. There was a time when I was younger when I think I was much more, you know, in a hurry, and it took me some time to realize, like, no, everything, you know, when I'm ready, and it's okay to, I think it's very important, especially for people who've been victims of sexual assault, to be very mindful and respectful of themselves, and to, you know, to decide, to have the agency to decide when and who and how you're going to disclose and how much. All of that I think is important. It brings me to one of my last questions, and then I'll move on to the audience questions, which is, you know, I've talked with lots of students, and I've heard them talk about their discomfort about sharing their stories, particularly stories around trauma. And they've said very directly to me, there's ways they've perceived that they've traded in their so-called pain for gain. Like, they felt like they've needed to tell stories about themselves in order to connect to opportunities and other sorts of things. Maybe they're not ready, but they felt they had to, like what you referenced. And I wondered how you dealt with your discomfort, or if you had discomfort about writing about, you know, your very personal experiences, and ways that you, in a way, allow us as readers to be witness to one of the most horrible, you know, experiences a human could have.
Yeah. So with our conversation prior, to just say it's not easy, and people shouldn't do it until they're ready. And also, I do think the pain for gain is real, where often people feel like they're asked again and again to be the person who bears witness to pain or racism or gendered violence. And I think that's real and is problematic, and we should all pay attention to that. I will say that I had to make very intentional decisions in this book about what I would share. And my instructor, who is also in your writing group, Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, I said, you know, do I really have to say what happened? And they said, you do. It's important that you don't leave it out. And I remember thinking that it was really, that if I really was, if my thesis was that this is a violent felony that has years of impact, that if I didn't show people what actually happens, and the level of terror and the level of violence, then when I talk about dismissal of rape cases and neglect and minimization and jokes, that you can't have one be as meaningful without the other. And I was ready to do it. I did it on purpose. And so I was okay with that. I think that I wouldn't necessarily recommend that people who have not done a lot of work and spent a lot of time on this material feel like that's what everybody should do, and that's what makes a book. That's only a very, very small part of the book. And actually, I was just talking about this the other day when I actually described what happened. I used a convention where my now wife asked me what happened, and I hadn't been able to tell her. And so in the moment that I'm about to tell the reader the story, I'm also telling her. And it's very clear that I feel loved and safe. And she says, you can tell me and I can handle it, and I'm here. And so I did that on purpose. Even though that is what happened, I felt like it would give the reader a little bit of a break. Like, they didn't have to take care of the narrator. She was in good hands, and she was going to tell this story because the story needed to be told. And so anyway, that was just something that I did that I'm glad I figured it out before I put it on the page.
Yeah, it's so complicated, and we do, I think, my support system, which overlaps with your support system in many ways in our writing community, I think that was incredibly important to me and made the difference and helped me be comfortable writing my book and publishing it in the way that I did. So I'm going to move over to some of the questions that I see from our audience members right now. And I'll start with a person who is a colleague of ours and friend, Mindy Nierenberg, and I'll read her question. Thank you, Michelle and Grace. Michelle, as a fellow survivor from a long ago past, I'm wondering about your writing process. Did you keep a journal through these years until you began writing the book, or did you solely retrieve memories about experience? I so appreciate your strength, especially since I haven't read your book, since I'm still not past the trauma that gets reactivated when reading accounts. How did you and do you maintain your well-being?
So thank you. That's a great question. I actually didn't keep a journal. And at one point I went into my basement and I found a journal that I kept right after the assault. And I remember reading it thinking, I had this experience like, oh my God, like it was like, I couldn't even believe what I was reading and how violent the assault actually was. It was like I had, put it away, and it was actually too far away. So about 10 years ago, I had been an English major in college, and I gave it all up after the assault and had a series of odd jobs. And when I eventually went to grad school, it was in public health. I felt like a different person. So about 10 years ago, I started writing. And part of it was I wasn't thinking about writing this story as a memoir. I was interested in just getting back to writing. And I was wondering why I had managed to maintain a relationship, why I had been able to go to school and have a family when I had met all these women, the ones who had found out their rape kits had never been tested and found out their perpetrators like 20 years later. And they were the ones saying to me, how did you manage to do this, that, or the other? And I was looking at them saying, what does it feel like to have your case solved? So I started writing stories about my family of origin because I was interested in resilience and how people survive and what lessons they take from people, even when they're kind of complicated characters, and you wonder if there's a lesson somewhere in there. So I started doing that, and then I also started writing a little bit about the assault. And through that process, I got a little more serious about writing. And a friend of mine said to me, you should really look at Grub Street, which is this writing collective that Grace is an instructor at. And it's an amazing, amazing place for emerging writers. And I applied for this year-long program, which I got in, which was surprising because it was hard to get in. And that's what really changed for me. That was in 2016-17. And I went every Monday night after work for a 3.5-hour class and started reading and writing much more seriously. And a year and a half later, I had a book deal after the class ended. I mean, it was kind of you know, maybe I was so ready to write the book that it all happened kind of quickly. And I don't think that happens for everyone. And like I said, it was 10 years before that where I just started writing to write again. But that was my process. I got back to it later in my life, and I found people to give me support. And I also started reading a lot of memoirs, and that was my process.
Yeah, it's, you know, this, Mindy had brought up this thing about reading accounts and things like that. And did you look at a lot of memoirs from people who had the same experience or similar experience? Sorry.
You know, I didn't. I read, I liked like I did read some where people talked about trauma, but I also was just interested in how people wrote. I really have always liked very direct writing. Like I love Grace Paley, I love Carson McCullers. I love people who write beautiful stories with very short and clear sentences and that make their characters come alive. And so I read Mary Carr and Allison Smith, who later became a friend, who wrote Name All the Animals, who just told this beautiful, sad story and described grief in such a profound and simple way that it just took my breath away. And so that's what I did is, and also the books that Alex recommended in our class, Son of a Gun and Wild and books like that. And of course I read your book and it was wonderful.
Thank you. Yes, and Alex, who's in my writing group, as a whole, asked me the same kinds of questions that they asked you, which was, you know, about the scenes and whether I would write the scenes of assault or not, and having to make those decisions, because I hadn't. Also, I just thought, well, we don't need to look at that, or you don't need to know what happened. But people said to me, like, no, actually we do. We don't actually know what happened, and
Yeah.
and so, you know, it's a decision to make. Okay, so there's a question from Chelsea Rowell, and I'll read the question. I'm curious about the speaker's perspectives on technology-facilitated sexual violence. So not necessarily physical assault, but things like non-consensual sharing of intimate images, etc. When so much of our lives are online, how does that complicate the question of whether this kind of violence is in fact violence and whether it's a crime?
Well, it is a crime. It is real, and it is a violation. And you know, the concept of I'm not a law enforcement official. I can't state the regulations, but somebody using material that's private without someone's consent is not okay. That's not even a strong enough term. I'm sort of at a loss for words. It is a violation. And you know, the use of the term violence, I think, is important, because I think people can have violence done to their psyche and to their sense of wholeness and their sense of personhood that is different than being physically assaulted. But you know, people talk about emotional abuse in domestic relationships, and it is very harmful and can cause lifelong concerns for the person who's experienced it. And so I don't know if your question is to say, is really about, I want to validate in the strongest terms that somebody who's experienced this has a right to feel traumatized and to at least, try to learn more about or go to people here at Tufts, like the care office or OEO, to get more information about how that might be addressed here at the university, and also to get information if somebody's ever interested in pressing charges, which they may or may not want to do. Grace, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as technology changes and our lives shift in relationship to that technology, I think that no matter what, if there is, a violation of someone's consent in all different ways, or ways that people are bullied or targeted. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to experience violence in the virtual realm. And I'm thinking about money and the ways, I don't know that much, but I know that there's ways like financial crimes that happen online, are like prosecuted, or they're considered like you're breaking the law.
Yeah.
So there's ways that they're quite similar. So anyways, the last couple of questions is by one person. I'll read the person's remarks. This is Corey Briskin. Person says, Michelle, you said that you're not a pro-carceral person. What does justice for rape victims look like to you, if not a prison sentence? It goes on a little bit.
Yeah.
What are your respective views on the value, efficacy of state sex offender registries?
Yeah, so here's the complication that some people who commit crimes of violence probably do need to, there needs to be a consequence that's meaningful. And so when I say I'm not pro-carceral, what I mean is that at the same time that we're looking to, perhaps in some cases, there are perpetrators of rape who do need to spend time in prison, I think we also need to look at the ways in which, if there's somebody of color who is accused of a crime, they are much more likely to be found guilty even when not guilty, as opposed to someone who's white who's accused of a sex crime, who's much more likely to have a lighter prison sentence or have an excuse made by a judge that they, like in my book, I talk about the recent case where, he comes from a good family and he'll probably go to a good college, that kid. That we need to think about reforming our criminal justice system at the same time that we look at what's an appropriate way to respond to crimes of rape. So I'm not saying nobody should ever spend time in jail, but I am saying that we need to look at our prison system at the same time that we look at this issue for perpetrators of rape. It is interesting. I know people who, when Brock Turner was sentenced to like 30 days or something for the assault on Chanel Miller, that there was a giant debate going on about, because he will be considered a sex offender for the rest of his life, and there were people who argued that punishment is as effective or more effective than having him be in jail more, because it will affect the rest of his life. And so that is a lifelong, as the victim would be in jail for, or impacted by what happened to her for the rest of her life, that this is a consequence that would impact his work, where he lived, and that is something that, while not spending time in prison, was, and I'm not an expert. I don't actually feel like I have all the answers on this, but I feel like the questions are really, really important. And these are the kinds of conversations I hope to have with many, many people over the next several years. And I'd really like to hear from people what their thoughts are on it, because I need to educate myself on a lot of the pros and cons of these really complicated issues, while we also try to make a more just society.
Yeah, thank you. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I was thinking about what are the ways that you've, I guess, this had come up in like another event that we had done, Michelle. So I'm trying to like frame it in the right way, but you know, there's this idea that I had, at least when I was growing up, that something like this happens, like rape, sexual assault, long-term child sexual abuse, and there's a way that your life is over. And as I started to like have a life and having that experience, I'm like, no, a life is over, like one part or like that I would have lived is done. That's true. But you know, I'm actually still here. I do enjoy my life. There are things that we can survive things like this or go through things like this and still, you know, make lives. And like I would even say to try very hard to make the most productive, meaningful, joyful, healthy lives that we can, even despite things like this happening. So I wondered about some of your thoughts about that, and you know, I guess things that make you feel joy and you're happy about and proud of, and all of that.
I think that's a great way to end. And I will say that since publishing this book, I did feel like I had a whole different life after this happened to me. And I felt like a lot of the ways that I felt bold and politically active in college took me a long time to get back to, but I did. And so what gives me joy now is that I do feel like I found work that's meaningful, that I got back to something that I loved very much, even 30 years later, that I, more importantly, have a family, a wife and kids who I love dearly, and many beloved friends. It's so funny that sometimes I'll be telling a story and I know someone's read the book, and so I'll say, yeah, my friend so-and-so, the one from the book. And all the people who are in the book, I'm still very close to, people that I knew in college and who are my dearest friends. And the person who introduced me to Anita Hill was actually the person who also took me into his and his wife's home when I was first attacked. And we're still friends, and I consider them family. And so I feel like I have a life that's full of joy and meaning. And I will never say that I'm happy that this thing happened to me. And it did change me forever. And I suffered for a very long time. But I also feel like I have a life that I wouldn't trade with anybody. And I feel very blessed for the things that I have worked hard to have. But I think that, overall, it's been really great for me. And so thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Michelle. So we're going to close the event. I want to thank you, Michelle, for taking on these questions and speaking about your book and your life experiences in such a honest and authentic way. And I want to thank the attendees for today, people who've been bold enough to ask questions. We appreciate them. Thank you for everyone watching the broadcast, and of course, our colleagues and everyone at Tisch College and at Tufts University. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Grace. And thank you, Tisch College, and to everyone who's been listening. It really was a wonderful event, and thank you for putting it together.